Thank you, Jessica. When we first decided to do this webinar, I planned to focus on a concept called meaningful monitoring, and we're still going to do that today. But given everything that has been happening in the last few weeks in Washington, I thought it might be helpful to talk about the regulatory and philosophical framework behind what we're seeing in the headlines. Okay, meaningful monitoring was designed to move from a compliance type of programmatic monitoring to more of a performance programmatic monitoring focused on outcomes. And that aligns perfectly with what the OMB is saying out of Washington, of course, OMB being the Office of Management and Budget. So 2 CFR 200.332, which comes from the Uniform Guidance. And of course, we all know what the Uniform Guidance is. It's the overarching regulatory authority for grants monitoring. And so this defines what is programmatic monitoring. We divide it into two parts, compliance and performance. And of course, compliance is just what it says. It focuses on, compliance with specific regulations. It tests whether the grantee is following the program design, meeting legal requirements, conducting scheduled activities. Performance testing focuses on outcomes, tests how well the grantee is performing against its goals and KPIs. And what we've seen since 2020, when Russ Voigt first took over the OMB Office of Management Budget from where the Uniform Guidance comes, we've started to see the shift in 2020, and now it's getting supercharged from compliance testing to performance testing. Now, states always had the flexibility to design robust performance testing, and OMB encouraged the use of performance measures, but hard outcomes, data-driven metrics are becoming increasingly important. 2 CFR 200.301 was changed as of October 1, 2024, and this lays out the requirements for the federal agencies, and we're going to see how these requirements trickle down to the monitoring program. The feds each agency is required to develop the grant program goals and objectives. And by the way, they have to be aligned with the agency objectives, clearly communicate to grantees how they will be measured, state in the federal award what the recipient must measure, and this goes back to that data, and must ensure those performance measurements align, as I said, with the federal agency's strategic goals, objectives, and performance goals. Now, where this monitoring comes in play is 2 CFR 200.329 talks about the recipient of the state and the subrecipients being responsible for oversight. So this idea that it's only federal money, this is not state funds, so we don't have to pay much attention, it's actually the opposite. Because it's federal money, it requires a lot more oversight, depending, of course, on the state rules that you have. Illinois, for example, has adopted the Uniform Guidance for all its grants, whether they're federally funded or not. But the recipient, it states right in the regs that you must monitor for performance expectations to ensure that they're being met, okay? And so then we have 2 CFR 200.301 gaining new meaning under the President's Management Agenda, which was released in December under something called OMB M2603. And it very specifically says, and this is codified on performance, the website performance.gov, contractors and grant recipients have to be accountable. And if you take that to the next step, it's accountable for results. And if you take that to the next step, it's accountable for results that are reflected in data. This is a very data-driven administration. So the bottom line is programmatic grants monitoring is changing. So the philosophy behind this, the paradigm, is as follows. Philosophy is accountability for results, shifting from rote administrative oversight to active executive management. Some of you may know that active executive management means that the agency heads or their deputies have to approve these grants to make sure that they align with the president's agenda. There's a return on investment mandate where grants are viewed as temporary investments. And we see this particularly in what we traditionally call welfare programs, where the goal is to get the recipient off the welfare. Funding is contingent. Again, there's the demonstrable results. Data, data, data. There's a de-emphasis on process, moving away from how a program is run to what it actually delivers. There's an emphasis on root causes, which is something we're very happy about because that is embedded in this meaningful monitoring concept that we coined in 2019. And so we're very happy to see a focus on what are the issues and what are blocking progress to accomplishing those issues. And, you know, I have on the slide just a little graphic that illustrates that. And today's paradigm also has a zero tolerance baseline, particularly for fraud. You know, those of us in the trenches know that under COVID, money was going out like crazy with this idea or this philosophy that we'll catch the fraud later. Just we want to stir the economy. We want the people to have this money very quickly. Fraud is a second thought. That's changed. That's completely out the window now. No legacy grant is safe. Every program must justify its existence. Now, you know, in preparing for this webinar, it became pretty clear to me how incredibly sophisticated this implementation or the actualization of this philosophy is in so many different areas, rules, documents, authorities. Traditionally in monitoring, we look to the uniform guidance to be our guidance, right? And the compliance supplement, which is how auditors implement the single audit and monitor the monitor, so to speak. But we're finding this philosophy popping up in so many different areas. It's even hard to keep track. And I call this the American of Pharaoh approach to rulemaking. I'm from Chicago, where the first Mayor Daley, Mayor Richard J. Daley, became arguably one of the most powerful mayors in American history. And he was a state senator. And they say in this book, American Pharaoh, that he would sit in his hotel room night after night after night in Springfield, Illinois, the capital of the state. And he'd be going through these rules and these laws with a fine-tooth comb, changing what he needed, while his colleagues were out there in the houses of disrepute, right? So he wasn't partying, he was going through the rules, and that allowed him to amass a tremendous amount of power. That's what we're seeing with OMB. In fact, Russ Voigt, who is the head of OMB and was the head in 2020, we can expect some of the initiatives he started in 2020 to come back, is my prediction, okay? He is become so powerful through this mastery of rules that, close some ears here, but he's being called the shadow president. So I just want to take a few minutes to go through some of these places we're seeing these rules. If you want to add some in the chat, we'd love it, because this is not a comprehensive list. And Liz McKay, who is our Chief Compliance Officer and one of our directors, she's going to be talking more about this on February 18 in our next webinar. She'll be digging a little bit deeper into all these changes. And Liz, by the way, by way of introduction, she helped manage $6 billion worth of Hurricane Sandy funds in New Jersey after the hurricane there. So of course we have the uniform guidance, which was updated in October of 2024. And then we have the new CFR 300, which Liz is writing about. And by the way, if you're interested in keeping up with this stuff, we appreciate if you sign up, connect with us on LinkedIn, also follow us on X, and we have other social media icons on our homepage of our website. So you have HHS's new CFR 300. Then you have the compliance supplement, which is over 2,000 pages, telling auditors how you're going to audit these grant programs. And of course, the section that we're really interested in, being a firm that does grants monitoring, is we're really interested in that area of how are they going to monitor the grants monitoring programs. We're expecting another update in 2026, which I think this philosophy that I'm talking about is going to be more embedded even more in the 2026 compliance supplement. We have OMB Circular A11, updated August 2025, talks about the annual performance planning and reporting. OMB A136, which talks about the PARs, the performance and accountability reports, and you'll see update, update, update. And that's important because it shows you, that's where these rules are changing. Circular A123 is being revised. The HHS grant policy statement, the new one just came out in October, and that is, again, reflecting more and more of this philosophy, this paradigm that we've been talking about. NOFO templates, grant applications must include stewardship certifications in the terms and conditions. So it's trickling down to the grantee contracts. Performance framework, rising our grantee awards. Performance framework, again, the reason I keep focusing on rules that may not specifically mention monitoring, because it trickles down to monitoring. And the performance piece, because we're talking about programmatic monitoring today, is really critical. It's all connected. And then we have OMB M2603, which reflects the president's management agenda, and that was released on December 8. We have ensuring accountability, how we oversee, audit, and improve. And that's not a typo. I thought it was a typo. That was missing something at the end, but no, that's the actual name. And that talks about how they're overhauling the single audit and financial audit process, I should say. Improving oversight of federal grant making. We have the big, beautiful bill, which addresses grant, and then the Walsh Act, which has not been, is introduced but passed yet. And again, if you have any additions to this list, we'd love to hear them, because it's a lot to absorb. So the bottom line is, in 2026, there's going to be more uncertainty. We've got legal battles underway. A lot of this is being challenged in court. We've got another federal shutdown possible January 30th. And of course, we have staff vacancies in DC. I just read a statistic, over 70,000 government workers and government-related workers have become unemployed or have left their jobs in the DC area. So this uncertainty is going to continue. But my personal opinion is that understanding the philosophy helps predict future changes in grants oversight. So if you know what's past, what the philosophy is, what Russ Voigt put in 2020, you can see that coming back. Again, this focus on performance metrics, you'll be able to adapt a little bit to the changes, and hopefully you won't retire. We'll stay in the game, because actually some of this is really exciting stuff. There's it's getting more meaningful, but it is pretty chaotic right now. So here are key federal initiatives affecting programmatic monitoring, and we're going to go through each of these now. Defend the spend, that's been in the news. HHS Deputy Secretary Jim O'Neill did a almost two minute video on YouTube explaining the freezing of some funds. Very important video. It mandates, and the reason, this is not only important for HHS programs, it's important even for construction and infrastructure, because the philosophy is permeating, beginning a lot of it beginning with HHS, but it's permeating, other programs as well. So it shifts from this pay and chase philosophy that I mentioned, where get the money out the door, worry about fraud later, to a prepayment gatekeeping, introducing a real-time verification requirement. This has resulted in the freezing of funds focused on these 5 states, but one announcement was for all 50 states. The judge has put a temporary hold on this freeze. But these 3 funds, Child Care and Development Fund, the TANF funds, SSBG funds were frozen because of the headlines. And what's so interesting about these grant fraud now is how it's become embedded in the American psyche. I mean, one citizen journalist going to a daycare center where there were no kids, and you can dispute whether it was the right hours and such, but that one video got 139 million views on X, okay? And so it's rare that our profession, which is grants oversight, is so much in the American psyche, but it absolutely is. And of course, as we know, this drives the political group, which filters down to those of us who are in the front lines. So existence testing is a term we use to say, there's no more fundamental test you can do of a program than to see whether it actually exists. Whether, in this case, a daycare facility exists, whether attendance numbers are legitimate. So programmatic monitoring has to include existence testing. Under Defend to Spend, effective agencies must develop DTS of evidence folders for each tranche of funding and complete mandatory justification fields in the payment management system. And this is, again, focused on HHS for every drawdown request. And then Defend to Spend is restoring attendance-based billing. States may now require payment based on verified attendance rather than just enrollment. So it's not enough to say I have 50 kids coming or enrolled. I have 50 kids actually coming. In the HHS Defend to Spend evidence folder, they're requiring a geotag facility imagery, which basically is a photo that can't be doctored, that shows the facility's exterior and main activity area. For those that have a lot of volume, they want a series of photographs of such, of course, redacting the children's faces. And then you have this public disclosure consent to say the grantee has to acknowledge that their receipts and their photos may be made public via the DOGE HHS transparency portal. Now, this is the controversial one. At Illinois, you can't ask someone coming into a daycare whether the parent or the child is a citizen, but Defend to Spend is based on the assumption that non-citizens, people who are not lawful permanent residents or they're not American citizens, are not eligible for these funds. So they're going to ask for testing of this. It's a big, big deal. And again, it's being challenged in the courts. And then you have automated integrity checks, do not pay clearance, make sure nobody's deceased, or incarcerated, whether it may not be daycare, it may be aging program for aging folks, or et cetera, whatever human services program it may be. There has to be these other matches. And one of the things that I haven't seen before, and maybe those of you on the front lines have seen it yourselves, but I haven't seen this high risk flag from childcare.gov fraud hotline. So that basically says if in this case, a daycare or a human services program is under investigation, they get this flag and you can't submit reimbursement for that. And then, of course, we have pass-through agencies are expected to apply data analytics to look for anomalies such as unrealistic attendance spikes. And if you haven't done so, we'd encourage you to look at our last webinar where we talk about the use of AI in data analytics to look for these kinds of things. And by the way, our firm would love to be able to help you build your Defend to Spend program, interact with your grantees, gather all the documentation, the boring stuff or the mind-numbingly difficult stuff that you may not have time to do. We'd love to do that for you, as well as help you with the data analytics piece. We've got a really great data team. And then, although this webinar is not about fiscal, there are some additional fiscal mandates in Defend to Spend, like making sure that everything is computerized. My goodness, I mean, how many daycare centers still are working with paper documentation? That's going to be a big deal. And I'm sure that's part of the court case as well. And then there's a lot going on with the indirect costs. So mission alignment grant programs are expected to advance the president's policy priorities. I think this has received so much press. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but they don't want to be funding diversity, equity, and inclusion, or the notion that sex is a chosen or mutable characteristics. This is coming right out of the executive order, or illegal immigration. And then data. These data-driven outcomes reporting, with objective, binary, and quantifiable metrics. So much of the evaluation is going to be based on this data that is linked to outcomes, and should be also linked to the federal agency's goals and objectives. Now, we talk about new requirements, but sometimes the requirements, the consequences are linked to existing requirements. That, for example, termination for convenience clause that we've seen popping up and being used left and right was rarely ever used before, right? But the consequences for performance failure have never been higher. And a lot of this is codified in Executive Order 14332. I don't know if codified is the technically correct word, but it's embedded in this executive order. And this again talks about the termination clauses, getting down to the grantees. Grant agreements must include terms and conditions that require grantees to provide written explanations or support for requests for each drawdown. We have, other remedies for non-compliance, basically cut the funding. Okay, that's what we're seeing. So that's the framework for programmatic monitoring. I hope that was helpful. Now I want to talk about the topic of the real topic of today's webinar, which is what we call meaningful monitoring, beyond compliance. So traditional compliance testing, let's take a look at that first. Some of the testing methods, which I'm sure are being used today, and it's fine, right? But the monitors would come and verify whether the programmatic reports have been filed. For IRPA, for example, these reports were required on a either monthly or quarterly basis. Did you file? Great. Check the box. You're done. You're compliant. You verify compliance with administrative requirements like HIPAA or Buy American and construction programs. Verify eligibility of recipients, excluding, of course, the immigration test. Verify the % of project completion. So this is a sample. Of course, programmatic monitoring has been the wild, wild west. People have been able to design their programs intentionally. That was the way it was originally created, to allow states to have the flexibility to design their monitoring the way they wanted to. But here's an example of one traditional programmatic monitoring indicator. You can also call it a standard or test rubric, whatever. So you have your citation, and for those of you who are not in education, excuse me, LEA stands for local education or agency or school, right? You need a parent involvement policy, and then you need to go through the evidence. And then I'm always a fan of ranking of using numbers to rank the compliance. The reason I like to do that is because then you can aggregate the data, as opposed to compliant or non-compliant. I like 1, 2, or 3, or maybe 4 and 5. I also like to do it to have a scale because I like to differentiate between the grantee who's put a lot of effort and they're almost compliant, but not quite there, and the grantee who has done nothing to comply with the requirement. Now, the benefits of this model was that it met the federal requirements for compliance testing, identified violations of federal law and regulation, was easy to design, fairly easy. Nothing's easy in life, or at least in this field. But compared to the new way, It was fairly easy to design, and it was fairly efficiently tested. You still went out in the field, you still looked for the evidence, or you had the grantee upload the evidence, but compared to the performance metrics, it was fairly easy. Now, the limitations of traditional compliance monitoring is that it prioritized testing of process and procedure over whether the funds were driving programmatic excellence. It's demoralizing. Grantees are running a million miles an hour and they're trying to get this done, and somebody comes in, knocks on the door and says, oh, but what about that? Well, that wasn't on my radar. Oh, what about that? That wasn't on my radar. I'm focusing on the most important things, which are maybe to educate children, maybe, right? It missed opportunities also to identify really important obstacles to program performance. Our meaningful monitoring is a two-way conversation where we ask about, how's it going, and what do you think? How do you think things can improve? Another limitation is that traditional compliance monitoring could miss significant fraud because it wasn't designed to pick up fraud, and documents tested could be easily falsified. So the other really important thing, and I've touched on it already, but I want to just dive a little bit deeper into this disconnect between an organization's strategic plan and the testing of its implementation through monitoring. There's a saying, what gets measured gets managed. A lot of this, of course, comes from the business world. These folks in Washington that are driving this performance-driven management are taking business concepts and bringing it to government. Okay, and again, some of you may have been doing this for years, so no short shrift to you, hopefully. No disrespect to those who've been doing this. But what gets measured gets managed. So if compliance is getting measured, the grantee will focus on compliance. If performance is getting measured, the grantee will focus on performance. So I have a little graphic here to illustrate this point. So in your standard program, you're creating a plan, strategic plan, you're training on it, you're telling everybody, okay, this is what we're going to do. You begin to implement the plan, then you monitor, hey, how's it going? Are we doing what we said we were going to do? Are there any problems along the way? And then you retrain and retool. Okay, but compliance monitoring in the traditional way breaks this continuum. Okay, and so here you have one group focused on creating the plan, training on the plan, implementing the plan. And then, as I said, the monitors came in and they're testing completely different factors, right, that are not related to performance. And that is really the heart of the problem with traditional compliance monitoring. And the result in the education world, which is our case study today, and no disrespect to our construction and utility folks here, please be patient with us, because some of these concepts still do apply. A school can be a compliant but a complete failure. And this was, I interviewed Phil Maestri in 2019, and he was the chairman of COFAR, which was the committee that created the uniform guidance. He also happened to be the chief risk officer of the U.S. Department of Education. And even then he was saying, we've got to have our monitoring, more performance-based. So if you have any questions, let's stop right there. If you have any questions, please upload them in the Q&A icon. And Liz McKay in particular is going to be available to answer them. I don't have access to the chat right now, but my team will interrupt me and say, hey, we need to talk about this, okay? So just bear with us on that. So meaningful monitoring is a process designed to ensure that grants monitoring has a meaningful impact on operations and program outcomes. It incorporates traditional compliance monitoring while aligning testing standards to the goals of the organization or the goals of the grant. This, again, permits grant recipients, leaders to focus on goals, not compliance. Now, everything's important, right? Give a grantee 150 things they need to do. And chances are, nothing's going to be implemented super super well. So if I have to choose between educating children or being compliant on some of these administrative rules, I'd much rather be graded on how I educate children. All right. So focus is always a great way to improve an organization. Meaningful monitoring, as I said, opens up a two-way conversation. It gives a voice to the people on the front lines. And this is based on the philosophy. Look, the people on the front lines, the people implementing these programs have so much more information often than the people at the top who are building the policy. And we want to grab that wisdom from the front lines. And not only wisdom, we want to understand what are some of the best practices they're implementing out in the field. When we did this project that now is called Meaningful Monitoring, we created a website and we highlighted all these wonderful things that we found were happening in the field. And of course, that increases morale. And then we'd say, okay, all right, you got your parent involvement policy in place. You've got this, Title I, a strategic plan. You've got all these things in place. Let's put the documents aside and let's say, how's it really going? Okay, what is stopping you from, in this case, educating children, right? And you won't not believe how critically important this conversation is and the things that you learn. So we did this, as in the school system. And of course, what are the obstacles to performance would translate to what are the obstacles to improving student achievement. So we heard a mouthful: high administrative turnover, teacherless classrooms. I always say, give me any large urban failing system, may not be urban, so could be rural, but any large failing system. And if you get three things in on the first day: teachers, technology, and textbooks, you're going to improve student achievement. So when you have classrooms without teachers for months at a time, obviously that there's nothing more fundamental than student learning than having a teacher, right? A lack of a sequenced curriculum, we heard that. Lack of classroom discipline, not enough backup from the principal, misspending and fraud, under-resourced classrooms. So let me just take one of those examples, the high turnover in administration, and walk you through how we can create a more a more performance and more meaningful monitoring process, okay? So after the first year of hearing these stories over and over of principals turning over, we began to ask a quantitative question, okay? And then we asked some qualitative questions as well. So we found that in a pool of, this is just 1 year, 33 high-risk schools, 60% reported having at least one principal change a year. One school had 7 principals in 5 years. Some schools experienced a turnover of the entire administrative team. So not only did the principal leave, so did the deputy or the vice principal, so did the chief academic officer, the curriculum director. These schools experienced, massive influx and of new people and turnover. Now, the ramifications, as you can imagine, curriculum and direction was constantly changing for the teachers. Administrators would come in, they'd have to reinvent the wheel. They couldn't find the documents, the policies, or they had to update them. The new administrators were unfamiliar with how to navigate the system, how to knock on the door in central office and say, I need this PO moved. There were glitches in processing. Energy, amazing amounts of energy was wasted, leading to low morale. Reforms didn't have a chance to grow legs. Every new principal would come in with a new agenda, and then they'd be gone. So the staff lose their loyalty when a leader is short term. I think many of us who've worked in bureaucracies have heard the term, this too shall pass, right? As it applies to bureaucracy, meaning, yeah, whatever, they want us to do this. Why should we answer? They're going to be gone shortly. Children wouldn't feel value. Children don't respect short-timers. In fact, we went to one classroom, and this related to teacher turnover, not administrative turnover, but the kids were had a game going. You know, how quickly could they torment the teacher? How quickly could they get rid of the teacher by tormenting that poor teacher? And, you know, they'd be like, yay, we did it. We got rid of another one, right? Well, you know, that's no environment in which to teach children. And of course, the contributing factors we learned through our monitoring process was, you know, sense of lack of control, lack of information, multiple bosses. The school boards were volunteers, and some of these school board members did not understand the difference between being a policymaker and doing day-to-day management. So they'd go in and fire a teacher for giving their child a D or F. So the politics were incredibly difficult to navigate because there were no boundaries on the volunteer school board members. There was just a tremendous amount of overload. In some cases, there were rural locations, a lack of benefits, especially retirement plans. You know, one principal told us he had 3 incredibly good teachers he was so excited about. He waited months and months for them to get their background checks. So by the time the background checks came in, the teachers were gone. You know, again, a number of these other challenges. So we came back based on our monitoring, our programmatic monitoring, and we said, how about instituting multi-year contracts and standards for dismissals for your principals? You know, training for school board members on what is the role of the school board versus the administrator. Creating support systems. You know, some of it, there were some cultural issues going on. You know, let's give our new people some understanding of what they're walking into and how to handle those things. Third parties to expedite background checks. Now, this gets to that root cause analysis, right, that we see coming out of Washington. Enhanced focus on codes of ethics. Look, you know, you can't, you know, bring in your, you know, your whole family as administrators and, you know, create this political fiefdom that is impairing your teachers from teaching. Enforceable standards, an orientation training academy. You know, where a new principal would come in and they would get all the documents. Now, what we ended up doing is we created a lot of these templates for policies, forms, and documents, like, you know, anything from a student code of conduct to how to handle drug and alcohol abuse. If a child comes in, what are the procedures there, to a memorandum of understanding for emergency preparedness with the local fire department. You know, and then of course we made a lot of other recommendations, but all of this came out of our programmatic monitoring. The other thing about meaningful monitoring is measuring progress against the performance goal and benchmarks in the grant application. And again, this aligns very much with what DC is doing. And we'd love to help you with this, your data strategy on this. And it also aligns monitoring indicators to priorities that have been identified in the agency plan. So let's take some examples of process questions versus performance questions, okay? Now, I have a caveat to say, all of this should be checked with your program officer if you can get a hold of them, right? I don't want to be, you know, the source for your legal advice because, you know, each of the agencies are getting a lot more information than I am. I'm taking this from all these different sources and giving you a framework, but I just want to caveat, check with your people on what they want, okay? So in infrastructure, a process question, was the concrete poured to the specified depth? Now, being a person who loves constructions for a long time, we know that's a really important question because if the concrete's not right and it's not of the right consistency, you know, the road will dissipate. But nonetheless, the outcome question would be, has the average commute time decreased? You know, a process question is, did the contractor follow Build America, Buy America rules for steel, right? Which we call a leading indicator, you know, to a result. But the result or the outcome, the impact would be, has the rate of vehicle accidents on this stretch of road dropped? Process question, So for a homeless shelter, are there 50 beds available? Is the staff to client ratio 1 to 10? If that's the requirement, are background checks on file for all volunteers? Not that those aren't important, but the impact question would be how many clients transitioned to permanent housing? And what is the recidivism rate for homelessness in the cohort that was measured? Education, did the workshops occur? Did each student get their promised tablet computer? Was the curriculum approved? 2, did the students' standardized test scores in math improve? How many students expressed an interest in a STEM career after the program? And this example, of course, is based on an after-school, science technology program. Here's some more examples of outcome-based metrics. In K through 12, if it's a program that's intended to promote charter schools, how many children transition to charter schools? Of course, not everybody agrees with that objective, but nonetheless, this is an example. Workforce readiness, are the students achieving, how many students achieved the industry recognized credentials? Human services, how many days did it take to transition? And again, forgive me if I'm using the archaic word welfare, but welfare recipients to working, to getting a paycheck. How much of the federal benefits were reduced? Okay. Again, this whole philosophy is we want to, these support systems are meant to be temporary for able-bodied citizens, who, not the elderly, obviously not the disabled. That's the philosophy. So we want to see them moving into the workforce. Infrastructure, right? Did you reduce the traffic delays? What was your cost per mile efficiency? Injustice, was violent crime reduced? Did you increase your clearance rate on arrests? Critical situation. This is a technical slide, but those in the utility industry will recognize these metrics. But the bottom line is, when there's a severe event or there's a routine outage, how long was the average customer in the dark? How long did it take to get back up and running? Is the overall reduction of utility outages have utility outages been reduced overall? The total number of minutes a year. If there's a major event, were critical infrastructure like hospitals, fire station, water treatment plants, I would add sewage, almost more important than water. And Liz will know what I'm talking about with Hurricane Sandy, and there's just the tons of sewage that were rising in the streets. So I should put sewage in there. But are those critical infrastructure programs being protected, or operations being protected? Do you have 100% uptime during a major event for those kinds of things? Now, the next part about meaningful monitoring is that I alluded to this before. It's a ruthless prioritization of indicators. Everything that's measured, someone needs to look at it and say, is this meaningful? Is this really furthering our goals? Or are we just asking the question to ask a question? So we looked at something that had 45 different monitoring standards for parental involvement, okay? And not to say they weren't important, but this is all about prioritization. So if you take these 45 standards, we can reduce them down to 10. Now, you may disagree with which 10 we chose, but I would argue that a parent knowing when their child misses a class or does not attend school is one of the most important involvements a parent can have in their education. Of course, we have the homework and everything else. But if the parent doesn't know their child is missing a class, how can they be involved? How can they be the best parent they can be? And I'll give you an example. When I was part of a small team running Chicago Public Schools in 1995 as part of the turnaround team. And so one of the things we did is we implemented a telephone calling system for also several, hundreds of thousands of parents, that if their child missed a day of school, they would get notified. It gladdened my soul when my assistant showed me her text messages, which is the current generation of technology, telling her when her son even missed a class, right? And that was very cool. And when we did that, that automatically increased attendance. Our parents notified when a child is disciplined. Our parents notified when a child exhibits signs of drug abuse or gang involvement or criminal activity. We did a security assessment, a little bit unusual methodology because, we believe that, absenteeism is the first sign of a security problem down the road. So we included, tell us how you're suspending your kids. What are you suspending your kids of? And of course, these are out of school suspensions. And we found that 70% of the out of school suspensions were for absenteeism. Go figure, right? But we also learned from that same group of counselors that they thought it was illegal to tell a parent whether their child was exhibiting, signs of drug abuse, like, fits of rage, for example, slurred speech, their eyes get dilated, the twitch above the eyebrow for cocaine, each drug has its own signs. And they thought that was illegal for them to talk about. Now, it's one thing to say, I'm going to suspend your child on a suspicion, that may be, so very inappropriate. But it's another thing to say, hey, we're seeing this. Johnny comes into class smelling like marijuana. And we did a survey of the teachers, and overwhelmingly, that was a huge problem. The numbers were unbelievable of kids that they, when surveyed, kids that they suspected of being on drugs. Well, let's tell the parents about that. Does the school inform parents when a child has been taught for 4 or more consecutive weeks by a non-qualified teacher? Right? I remember the day I walk into a classroom and there's I'm looking, where's the teacher? Where's the teacher? Well, it's a 18-year-old, and they're all, her head's down on the desk. All the, lots of the kids are heads down on the desk, and they're watching War Horse, right? Well, shouldn't a parent know about that? Okay. How are parents, and I believe that's at least at the time that was required that they be notified, but sometimes that didn't happen. So let's monitor whether that's happening. Are parents notified about a child's progress on achievement scores, right? Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't, and et cetera, et cetera. So these are just some examples of how to make your monitoring protocols, more meaningful. So the result here was cutting 45 standards down to 10. It was 11, but for the purposes of this presentation, I cut it down to 10. So what are the benefits? Of course, it increases morale because you're talking now the language of the grantee. If the grantee is serving homeless folks or is building a new bridge, you're talking about the new bridge, right? You're talking about, how they're doing that. And that automatically increases morale. It permits data aggregation to identify district-wide or statewide trends leading to systemic change. So, for example, we also looked at teacher turnover. 57% of high-risk schools had at least one classroom without a teacher for more than 30 days. At least 29% of high-risk schools reported that internal or school board politics was a barrier to student achievement. These were statistics that we started gathering after the first year of saying, essentially, how's it going? And then we were able to look at the root causes. We saw paraprofessionals were teaching core subjects. There was misspending of taxpayer funds, so the money was being diverted to things that had nothing to do with kids' education. There may be trips for, the administrators and such. We hate to see that kind of thing. Textbooks, technology. Again, very, very important. We found that school after school, so one school didn't have homework for 2 years because the copier was broken. And we kept hearing these stories about not getting the technology. And we found that somebody in central office was sitting on a pile of purchase orders that had not been moved. And, the client, of course, based on this information, quickly addressed that issue. Defective technology, discipline practices that endanger children, gang and drug cultures. These are some of the things that we were picking up. Meaningful monitoring also reviews how organizations align the resources to support the identified goals. I just talked about that. The way that we design it is, if a school, in this case it was a school, is showing signs, red flags of fraud, then, you bring in a SWAT team, okay? I don't see a lot of programs doing that, but I think it's really important that you have a group of qualified people that understand fraud to come in when you see something like we saw in one school. There's $14 million in the school fund. All the school board members had personal accounts in that same bank, and they had the technical capability of moving funds back and forth between those two. Right. Well, we never would have heard that or known that if I didn't ask a low-level person in the fiscal team, is there anything you're concerned with? And because those bank statements hadn't been reconciled for 6 months, we don't know what happened. We didn't have any evidence of fraud, but it certainly created, if anything did, a argument that there should be a team going in there. And, if you haven't seen our, as I said, our webinars on fraud, it'd be a great idea to look at them if this is of interest to you. Because one of the things we saw in the Feeding Our Future scandal in Minnesota that we talked about in October was that it was a group of nutritionists who were managing this that didn't have that background. But we also learned they tried very, very hard to solve this problem and did not have the support that they needed to do that. And that's coming out in the news in a very big way right now. So if you have questions, again, please type them into the Q&A feature. And of course, I'd just like to take a moment to explain that we'd love to support you. We have created, based on the Defend the Spend model, support services. We have a wonderful data team that can help you develop your data strategy and metrics, and also, interface with your grantees on their Defend the Spend folders once that becomes implemented in a way, and that, and again, we'd love to hear from you on what you're seeing in the field. Of course, we have meaningful monitoring. We have Agent Tipster, which we talked about in our last webinar on how to use AI and data analytics to look at fraud. Guardrails 360, we help you build your policies, procedures. We do a gap analysis, take a look at your grants program. Is this compliant with this new reg? Is this compliant, even new reg, old reg, whatever? We've taken 700 grant activities, and we're kind of compressing those a little bit, but we've created a tool where we're aligning all these requirements with each of the stages of the grant program. And we also can do due diligence on your subrecipients. We've done that for years and years in the private sector in particular. And then we have targeted technical assistance and training that's based on all of this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Jessica.
All right, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Mary Beth. Like Mary Beth said, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the QA feature. We do have one right now. It says, what are the legal arguments in the case regarding the freezing of the funds?
Okay, I'm going to turn that over to Liz McKay, our compliance attorney.
Good afternoon. And before I answer that question, Mary Beth's reference to the sewage was an allusion to in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, and I have worked for the state of New Jersey during that time. The water treatment plants, of course, that are powered, in this case, by electricity, failed. The operations failed. So that obviously created quite a problem. Anyway, in terms of the question about the legal arguments with respect to freezing these programs, funds to the programs for the Health and Human Services, one of the counts would be a violation of the Administrative Procedure Act. It's a federal agency, when it does something like terminate funding or dramatically changes the rules, needs to go through a certain process. So the argument is this was a final decision without a process. Also that the freeze was arbitrary and capricious. There was no reasonable basis given for this freeze and no indication that there was consideration of the effects of a freeze like this that was immediate, that was across the board, and that happened without any indication of when the freeze would finish. And the violation of the separation of powers clause, because the Congress has the power of the purse and the power to legislate. So did the executive branch usurp the power of the Congress when it takes money back or freezes funds that the Congress has appropriated, or changes the nature dramatically of the programs that Congress has appropriated? And whether or not it's Health and Human Services, whether it's programs, environmental programs or energy programs, there have been a lot of freezes or terminations of funding in various agencies for various programs throughout the government. And the one consistent count or consistent problem expressed in these court filings has been that there's a separation of powers. So this is obviously a constitutional issue. And I don't think anyone would be surprised. We have these filings for injunctions to prevent these terminations, prevent the freezes in all areas of the courts, all levels, whether it's district courts or circuit courts. No one would be surprised if the Supreme Court eventually weighs in on this question.
And Liz, I'd like to just mention one other thing, and thank you for answering that question.
Sure, you're welcome.
If, one of the things I'd like to ask the group is would anybody be interested in getting together for some discussion on this? So I'm not doing all the talking. We'd love to hear what you're seeing in the field and maybe get together a peer group of from various states to talk about that. If you have any interest in that, please let us know either through my email or in the chat. And the other thing is, let us know how we did today. If there's something that you would like us to address in the future, I believe a brief survey would go out. We really appreciate it because it makes the information we're providing you more relevant to you. And so again, with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica to close this out.
All right. Are there any other questions that we have? All right. Well, thank you once again, Mary Beth, for presenting today. If you would like to watch this webinar again, share with your colleagues, refer to it back as a resource for the future, the video recording will arrive to your inbox in a couple of days' time. If you would like to receive invitations to future webinars, you can sign up for our mailing list on our website. Please be sure to register for our next webinar hosted by our attorney, Liz McKay, titled The New Grants Paradigm, a Regulatory Overview, on February 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. You can also view our previous webinars on our website as well. If you have any additional questions regarding the information that was presented today, you can email us using the information on the slide on your screen. Furthermore, we encourage you to visit our resource library to discover a wealth of grants oversight resources to help you manage your grant program. Our resource library can be found on our website at vanderbiltgroup.com/resources. All the links are posted in the chat as well as presented on the slides. Once again, thank you for attending our webinar, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.